go. Right.
God instructs Noah, the only righteous man in a world consumed by violence and corruption, to build a large wooden teva, ark, coated within and without with pitch. A great deluge, says God, will wipe out all life from the face of the earth. But the ark will float upon the water, sheltering Noah and his family, and 2 members, male and female, of each animal species. Rain falls for 40 days and nights, and the waters churn for 150 days more before calming and beginning to recede. The ark settles on Mount Ararat, and from its window Noah dispatches a raven and then a series of doves to see if the waters were abated from the face of the earth. When the ground dries completely, exactly 1 solar year, 365 days, after the onset of the flood, God commands Noah to exit the teva and repopulate the earth. Noah builds an altar and offers sacrifices to God. God swears never again to destroy all of mankind because of their deeds, and sets the rainbow as a testimony of his new covenant with man. God also commands Noah regarding the sacredness of life. Murder is deemed a capital offence, and while man is permitted to eat the meat of animals, he is forbidden to eat flesh or blood taken from a living animal.
Right. Thank you. So, Rabbi Sachs says that he once asked Paul Johnson, who famously wrote The History of the Jews. Anyone got that book? I think I've got it somewhere. Anyone got The History of the Jews by Paul Johnson?
No, don't remember that.
Very well-known book, very good, very, very extensive history. Don't remember what period it covers, but very extensive. He was actually a Catholic. So Rabbi Sachs asked him what was the thing that struck him most. And this is a paraphrasing of what he replied. Whoops, not working. Right. Oh, there's more. Sorry, Iris, carry on. There's another.
Oh, sorry, hang on. Where am I? Is it? Where? I haven't got any more. I've just got the same page.
Noah plants a vineyard.
It hasn't moved.
It's messed up. Sorry, one sec. Oh, 1 second. Resume. Try now. Is that there?
Hang on.
Yes.
Yes. Hang on a moment.
Oh, yeah. Noah plants a vineyard.
Noah plants a vineyard and becomes drunk on its produce. 2 of Noah's sons, Shem and Japheth, are blessed for covering up their father's nakedness, while his 3rd son, Ham, is punished for taking advantage of his debasement. The descendants of Noah remain a single people, with a single language and culture for 10 generations. Then they defy their creator by building a great tower to symbolize their own invincibility. God confuses their language so that one does not comprehend the tongue of the other, causing them to abandon their project and disperse across the face of the earth, splitting into 70 nations. The Parsha of Noach concludes with a chronology of the 10 generations from Noah to Abraham, later Abraham, and the latter's journey from his birthplace of Hastim to Haran on the way to the land of Canaan.
Right, thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, so now let's see Paul Johnson. Who'd like to read Paul Johnson?
I'll read.
Go on.
There have been in the course of history societies that emphasize the individual, like the secular West today, and there have been others that placed weight on the collective, communist, Russian, or China, for example. Judaism was the most successful example he knew of that managed the delicate balance between both, giving equal weight to individual and collective responsibility. Judaism has a religion of strong individuals and strong communities. This, he said, was very rare and difficult and constituted one of our greatest achievements.
Right. I may have said it before. Are we, is the Torah aligned with right-wing sort of capitalist society or socialist society? So the answer is yes and yes, right? The Torah speaks of individual property ownership, individual rights. Yes, the Torah tells us you're not supposed to give more than 20% of your income to charity. You are supposed to have wealth for yourself. On the other hand, the Torah obviously promotes a lot of social conscience and societal things and charity and setting up institutions in society, more kind of, certainly when Mrs. Thatcher, allegedly she never actually said there's no such thing as society, but when she did, right, we would disagree. Society and civilization is crucial. So Judaism is very much a hybrid of individual and collective. Anyone know where we see this in a very famous example that we probably all know once I put it on the screen? Famous quote from Hillel.
Remind us.
It's not on the screen.
Yeah, it's not on the screen yet.
Right, here we
No.
go. Who'd like to read?
Oh,
Anne,
yes,
to read.
Shall I read it?
Go on.
He, Rabbi Hillel, used to say, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, then when?
Right. So if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Individual responsibility. But if I'm only for myself, what am I? Collective responsibility. And if not now, when? Carpe diem, seize the day. So let's now have a look at Parshas Noach through this interesting lens of, on the one hand, the flood, and on the other hand, at the end, we have the Tower of Babel. Right? On the surface, they have nothing in common. Let's look at the scriptural reference to them. First of all, this is the reference to the flood. Who'd like to read?
I'll read.
Go on.
The world was corrupt before God. The land was filled with violence. God saw the world and it was corrupted. All flesh have perverted in a way on the earth.
Right. So wickedness, violence, corruption, perversion, moral failure. Right. The world was a moral failure. Right. Interesting. It uses the word Hamas, which means mayhem and terror. Right. Go figure. Although the modern Hamas is an Arabic acronym, but sure. Now, so the flood happens because the world is corrupt and the land is filled with violence, and Hashem has had enough, and he sees the corruption and the perversion, and he causes a flood. Now, Babel, on the other hand, Bavel, completely different. Let's see what happened with Bavel. Who'd like to read number 4? Anna, you'd like to read?
The entire earth had one language and a common speech.
Right, on the surface, that's not a bad thing, surely. They wanted to construct. They didn't want to destroy. What was their sin? And yet what happens afterwards? They're all scattered. And next week, Avram is summoned to bring a new chapter in the history of mankind. Right? So what happens at Bavel? On the one hand, God said, I won't cause another flood. Right? Here's the promise. I'll read. Never again will I curse... can't get rid of... Oh, here we go. Never again will I curse the soil because of man, for the inclination of man's heart is evil from his youth. I will never again strike down all life as I've just done. Basically, it's almost like I'm resigned to the fact that men have an evil inclination, but I'm going to destroy the world every time they misbehave. There's going to be no world left, basically, right? Okay. So on the other hand, what does he do? He scatters them. So in both scenarios, Hashem intervenes as an intervention as to how we should live our lives, right? In the first one, it's an extreme intervention of flooding the whole world and only leaving Noah and family behind. In the second one, it's an intervention of scattering everyone throughout the world. So, interestingly, there is a suggestion, the historians suggest that there were many floods and flood myths in Mesopotamia. Excavations revealed also that evidently there was a tower in Babylon. Did you know this? Which was 7 stories, 300 feet high. And they found the remains of other towers as well. So there may well be historical evidence. That's not actually the point, because the Torah is not always about history. The Torah means hara, means instruction or teaching. So what are these stories there to tell us? Why are we told about the flood? Why are we told about Bavels? The answer is that there must be some moral or political, spiritual truth that the Torah is teaching us about humanity. In this case, it's the failures, coming back to our original point, that we said that there have been societies that were individualist and there have been societies that are collective, and they've all failed. So what's going on here? Actually, it's a similar thing. The flood tells us it doesn't work when each man is for himself and you have anarchy, right? And you have violence and mayhem. No, you have to have law and order. You have to have rules and you have to have morality. On the other hand, Bavel tells us that what's the problem with Bavel? So maybe the problem with Bavel is it's very nice everyone's speaking one language and climbing a tower, but actually that's the, you know, the collective replacing the individual, which is also not a good thing. Let's see what Thomas Hobbes, who wrote a famous book called Leviathan, which is absolutely fascinating, because of course the Leviathan is the famous fish that's going to exist in the times of Mashiach, the like mythical fish. Might not be a myth, might be real. So interestingly, that's what he called this book about politics, Foundations of Modern Politics. He lived in the 16th century. Let's see what Hobbes had to say. Who would like to read Hobbes? Who's feeling political? Is Julian there? No. Pam, do you want to read? Oh, Iris, we're back to you. Sorry, I forgot you. Would you like to read?
I think it's you.
Oh,
right. I don't know. You or me, I don't care.
Tom.
You can read it.
Okay. Before there were political institutions, human beings were in a state of nature. They were individuals, packs, bands. Lacking a stable ruler, an effective government, and enforceable laws, people would be in a state of permanent and violent chaos, a war of every man against every man, as they competed for scarce resources. There would be continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Right, and you have such situations in certain states today, right? What they don't show you on TV, I just saw a thing of Hamas people, they call them fighters, I would call them terrorists, Hamas people, I guess, members, shooting people in the leg because they're accused of collaborating with Israel and laughing about it. Iran just executed a load of political opponents. Do you have societies even nowadays that do not have basic rights? And that's the basic description of the life before the flood. There's no rule of law. The world is filled with violence, right? And even when you have, so you can even have, certainly when you have the law of the jungle and you have no legal system at all. You know, there's a big thing, this thing in America, defund the police. Anyone follow this defund the police thing? It's extremely frightening. So after George Floyd, you had all these things, defund the police, you know, stop funding the police. I still fail to understand what the alternative is. So we're not saying, for example, defund the NHS and put the money into the private sector to provide better healthcare. We're not saying like defund the police and create a new police force. They're just saying stop giving money to the police because they're racist. Okay, there may be a racism problem in certain police forces, but if you're going to take their funds away, you're going to have no protection in society. You're going to have anarchy and chaos. And I believe that happened in a few cities at the time of the Black Lives Matter. There were cities that froze police funding. It doesn't work. You can't do that, right? You can't have a society that works like that. It's extremely dangerous. You need, the state is not perfect. And when we have failed states or we have failed institutions, things go wrong, and certainly policing is a good example where often it's far from ideal, particularly in terms of racial bias. But still, the answer is not to have anarchy and no law and order. So this is essentially what's described before the flood. The world is full of anarchy and violence and robbery and pillaging and each man for himself. And after the flood, we haven't put them on the screen here. We have the Noachide laws. We have basic rules of society. So that's on the one hand, right? That's the flood. He doesn't call it the flood there, Hobbes, but basically describing a primitive society over modern Western democratic society, right? Do we think democracy is a good thing? There's definitely downsides to democracy. There's downsides to the liberal nature of Western society from a religious perspective, right? Obviously, conservative Muslim societies are going to be more sympathetic to things like modesty laws or, not drinking excess alcohol and people not misbehaving socially. And probably, they say Dubai is not a particularly repressive Muslim society, but you're not allowed to drink alcohol officially. They say it's one of the safest places to go. There's no crime. There's a reason for that. So on the one hand, some of these societies, that's great. On the other hand, we know history has shown us that Jewish people don't do well when we live in repressive societies. Think Russia and the Shoah and what have you, and nowadays. So, why do people love America? It was the Golden Medina. It was a free country, right? It comes with challenges as well. Europe is relatively free. So on the one hand, there's definitely downsides to freedom and Western democracy in terms of perhaps moral values and family values going out the window. But on the other hand, it's much safer. You have law and order, you have freedoms, you have rights, you're protected in certain ways. You don't have that in these other places. So that's on the one hand. right? That's the whole flood. Pre-flood anarchy and chaos, post-flood relative law and order. Although, of course, you've got Sodom and Gomorrah still coming up in a few weeks' time. Now, what about the Babel, on the other hand? So what does it say regarding Babel? So it says that the entire land had one language and a common speech. Right? We assume that there was a time where humanity was very primal and they didn't have languages. But interestingly, Babel is not the first time that this comes up. Let's have a look at Genesis 10, chapter 5. Who would like to read? Any volunteers?
Okay.
Go.
From these, the maritime people spread out into their lands, in their clans, within their nations, each with its own language.
Right. This is before Babel. So it seems that earlier on it says even they spread out into their own clans, their own nations, each with its own language. And by the way, I mean, we could debate also the pros and cons of nationalism, right? When you have people split, a lot of wars nowadays happen because nations don't like each other, right? And then you have, Europe is officially now united, EU and what have you. America had civil war, and now, the states are united. So on the one hand, sometimes national identity is a cause of strife. But anyway, there is a source earlier on where it talks about people having their own languages. So it's not entirely clear that, but it says at Babel that God split them up and divided the languages. So what's going on here? So interestingly, I haven't got it on the screen, but the Gemara does actually discuss a machlokes in Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yochanan, whether the division of humanity into the traditional 70 languages that we always talk about, 70 nations, occurred before or after the flood. So it could be that actually it occurred before that. And then you've got to ask why it says that everyone had one language by Babel. So maybe it's metaphorical. Maybe it doesn't mean exactly. So when it says that everybody said that the world was of one language and one tongue, which it says right before the building of the Tower of Babel, wait a minute. If they'd already been divided into 70 languages, that makes no sense unless we take that as metaphorical. So it's saying that, people were, you might say, they spoke with one voice. Right? It doesn't mean they literally spoke with one voice. It means that they had common cause. So maybe it could be, according to that machlokes in the Gemara, if you say the 70 languages was after Babel, that makes sense. But if you say that it occurred even earlier on with these peoples that spread out into their own nations with their own languages, then what's the Tower of Babel when it says the whole world had one language? So it must be saying metaphorically that people were united. Now, interestingly, it's been a practice since time immemorial that when people conquer somewhere, they impose their culture, right? I'm sure it happened during the World Wars. That you would one way you would conquer a people is you would force them to speak your language, right? By the way, this one of the arguments, rather spurious arguments for Russia invading Ukraine, was all about they called it they dared to call it the Nazification of parts of Russia, basically accusing Ukrainians of trying to steal their languages and impose Ukrainian culture. I mean, it's all spurious, but this kind of thing. So let's just have a quick look at some sources. Thanks, Rabbi Sachs. Ashurbanipal II, I don't know who he was, and Sargon II. These were Assyrian rulers. So Assyrian, we always talk about Hanukkah as the Assyrian Greeks. This is what we've got apparently archaeological evidence of. So who would like to read this? Quite interesting what it says in the various scrolls that were found and cylinders. Any volunteers? Who hasn't read for a while?
I'll read, but I can't read the first.
Yeah, I was going to read Pam, but I can't read that either.
I'm assuming it's phonetic. Ashurbanipal. I don't know.
Barnacle, the second. Take the total of all people's speech, one speech. Sargon the second, population of the 4 quarters of the world with strange tongues and incompatible speech, whom I have taken as booty and the command of the Asher, my lord, by the might of my scepter, I cause to accept a single voice. Sorry, Pam.
Right. Okay. So it seems to be this idea that when you conquer somewhere, when you're talking about ruling somewhere, it says they had incompatible speech. They were taken as booty and they were forced to accept a single voice. So the idea of a so although it might sound benign, the idea of everyone speaking one language can potentially be a very oppressive one. It's a way that people would oppress their populations, interestingly. So it could also be that when it says everyone spoke one language, it signifies some kind of oppressive society. Let's have a look at an interesting little thing here. Hebrew rules, you should look at the use of the Hebrew. We don't do it enough. A lot of the slides I've put English only, but here we've got the Hebrew. So I'll just read this. You can see we've got letters in large, words in large print there. Hopefully you can see. Let me get my, how do I get my,
Yeah.
1 second. Get my, just give me a sec. How do I get my highlighter? Come on, highlighter. Don't know, never mind. Get my mouse. Oh, can everyone see my mouse?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
So it says Vayoimru. This is what they said regarding Baal. Hava is like come. Let us come. Come. Nivne lanu ir umigdal v'rosha b'shamayim v'naseh lanu shem. Let us build a city and a tower whose head will be in the heavens, top in the sky or the heaven, and we'll make a name for ourselves. Pen nafut. Pen means in case, lest. Right, in good old English, lest we become scattered all over the world. Now, here's one from Shemos, from Exodus. This is Pharaoh speaking. Hava nischak malo. He says, let us come. Let us basically outfox them. Nischak is from chachma, right? Let us deal shrewdly with them. Who? The Jews. Pen, lest yirbeh, they increase v'haya kisegrena milchama, and they'll, if there's a war, they'll join our enemies. So we have the same use of the Hebrew. Hava, ... let us do a certain thing, right? In the first case, it's build a city and a town. In the second case, it's basically instigate against the Jews. Pen, lest something happens that we don't want to happen. So this interesting construction. So the language is not accidental. So in both cases, we've got an empire that is basically riding roughshod over its population. So Babel says, come, we've got to do this. We've got to build this tower. We've got to make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered all over the world. It's a bit benign. In the case of Egypt, saying, come, we have to basically instigate against the Jews. Otherwise, they may become too many for us. So it seems to be a language that suggests when you have a slightly panicking group of people or a regime that wants its own way. So here's an interesting reread of the story of Babel. In chapter 10, we are told that humanity was divided into 70 nations and 70 languages. In chapter 11, we're told how basically one power is conquering the other nations and imposing its language and culture on them, which goes against the idea of the individual and the integrity of the individual. So when it says God confuses the language of the builders, he's not creating some new state of affairs. He's actually just restoring the old. So in other words, the classic understanding, according to one view, would be that they all spoke one language until then, and then because they're speaking one language enabled them to conspire, God scattered them and gave them different languages, right? The slightly more nuanced reading would be that we actually have sources in the previous chapter. This is chapter 11, right? Chapter 10 says they were already spread out around the world with different languages. So when it says that they came with one language to build the tower, it's saying that they came as one with great power and with overreaching power to try to impose. So let us build a tower reaching the heavens. In other words, let us be all powerful. Let us be like God, right? That's what it says. We'll be like God. Shem says, no, this is not right. There's a reason you should be scattered around the world with different languages, meaning individuals are important. It's not just about collectives. Okay.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
That first one about the maritime clans and speaking that was before the flood, yes?
Correct.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, then surely the story of the flood means that all those languages were destroyed anyway. All those nations were destroyed.
No, sorry, no. I think it's no. Sorry, 1 second. It's after the flood.
Oh, right.
It's after the flood. It's after the flood, before the story.
Before Babel.
Right.
Okay.
So
Actually,
the Torah doesn't always have exact chronology, but there's probably a reason for this chronology. So this is why Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yochanan argue in the Gemara. I didn't look up the actual Gemara. I probably should have done, but in the Gemara in Megillah, So if you say that the division of language is post-Bavel, so that's it. Bavel is you have unity, but then unity brings about people come too powerful and they want to try to challenge God. And he says, no, this is why I'll scatter you. Alternatively, they're already split into nations, and the unity of Bavel is not necessarily the whole world as one speaking one language. It's the idea of a group of people becoming too powerful and the collective overtaking the individual. And God says, no, I'm going to confuse your language, meaning I'm going to restore your individuality. So in one point, we have the individuality of 70 cultures, right? So on the one hand, you have to have law and order. You need society. You can't have each man for himself. That's what the flood teaches us. That's why God punishes us. And in fact, after the flood, he creates, although it's not explicit, the Noachide code of basic code, universal code for humanity. You need law and order. You can't defund the police. On the other hand, if the state becomes too powerful and dominates the individual, then we also have a problem. We see that in our societies today, right? In communist societies and others, where the state becomes too powerful. So, coming back to the original quote from Paul Johnson, right? What was the greatness of Judaism? That there were societies that emphasized the individual, and there were societies that emphasized the collective. And for different reasons, they often failed. Judaism found this hybrid between the individual on the one hand, but the collective on the other. So, for example, so the rule of law is crucial, but it mustn't be used to suppress individuals and their distinctive languages and traditions. That's wrong. So the rule of law becomes too powerful, particularly it becomes oppressive, and it starts to squash individuality, individual cultures. Right? In our case, that's often what's cost us Jewish practice, right? Communist societies were all powerful. The state was all powerful. You know, those of us who read 1984, you know, frighteningly real in today's world in some societies, right? Or it doesn't even have to be now. You go back to, you know, even Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s, you know, or East Germany, you know, snooping on its citizens, arresting them for thought crimes effectively. Right? It wasn't very far off from what 1984 predicted. Right. And as for having the leader on every corner, well, when they invaded Iraq, they had Saddam's picture on every corner. So, you know, we've seen these things in reality. So monotheism is that unity in heaven still creates diversity, and not only creates diversity, but God says to us, you have to respect that diversity. So you've got the Parsha of Noach starts with the flood, ends with the Tower of Babel, complete opposites on the one hand, but actually it's a brilliant observation on the human condition that you need a collective culture, you need a society, because otherwise you have anarchy and violence. On the other hand, you need individualism, otherwise you have oppression and tyranny. Now, no one's saying the people above were oppressed, but what's the crime otherwise? So they wanted to build a tall tower to reach heaven. So the suggestion is that it's this domination which is a problem. But so turns out Paul Johnson was actually right. Let's see Rabbi Sachs's quote. Let's finish with that. Who'd like to? Oh, that's not it. Oh, I didn't do it. Sorry. Right. The final quote was from Rabbi Sachs that after the two great failures of the flood and Bavel, Avram, of course, next week is called on to create a new form of social order that gives honor to the individual and the collective, personal responsibility and the common good. And that is the gift of Jews and Judaism to the world. And that is Judaism. Judaism believes in, you know, certainly certain principles that be aligned with socialism, but equally many principles that be aligned with capitalism. So we're politically neutral, but more than that, we're ideological. You know, at best, a very benevolent form of capitalism or a very individualistic form of socialism. And that's quite unique that the Torah gives us that basis for both law and order, but individualism at the same time. Right. There we go. An interesting different take on the flood and the Tower of Babel, thanks to Rabbi Sachs. Any questions, comments, observations? Is it still zooming you, Pam and Iris? I wasn't paying attention.
Oh, I can't. Can I just press that?
Yeah.
I don't know, because we didn't have our screen bit on.
Ah, okay. Interesting. Right.
We have now.
Okay.
Well, it would block the wording, having the pictures on the bottom.
Right. Right. Okay. All right. Well, have a great week, everyone.
And to you, Rabbi.
Thank you. And to you.
I'll put a reminder on the group. Next week, I'm taking Bear to the airport. I hope to be back in time, but it just depends on traffic. So I'll have to just update.
The next 2 Mondays we'll be away because we're on
Oh.
holiday.
Where are you going?
Okay.
A cruise.